The Fairey Fulmar was a British carrier-based fighter that arrived aboard HMS Illustrious in 1940, and it was slow from the moment it first flew. Built as a two-seat fighter to satisfy an obsolete Air Ministry requirement, the Fulmar sacrificed speed for an extra crew member, something the Royal Navy thought it needed for navigation and gunnery control. In reality, it needed neither. The aircraft managed just 330 kilometers per hour at altitude, making it barely faster than many bombers of the era. Against Italian fighters like the Machi C-200, the Fulmar was outrun and outmaneuvered. It was kept in service anyway, mainly because there was nothing better available to the Fleet Air Arm at the time. The American Brewster Buffalo entered service with the U.S. Navy in 1939 and immediately became an aircraft that pilots dreaded flying. It was underpowered, handled poorly, and offered almost no margin for error in combat. The Buffalo was slow to climb, sluggish in turns, and suffered from a landing gear that frequently collapsed, a particularly embarrassing problem when returning to a carrier. By 1941, pilots were openly hostile to the aircraft. When the Buffalo faced Japanese Zeros in the Pacific, the results were predictable. In 15 minutes of combat over Midway, pilots in Buffaloes were shot down at a rate of 11-to-1. The aircraft was officially described as not suitable for combat by multiple squadrons, yet it remained in frontline service for far too long because the Navy had invested money in its production. The Seafire was a carrier-borne version of the Spitfire, and it represented a fundamental misunderstanding of how to adapt a land-based fighter for naval operations. The airframe was too fragile for the stresses of carrier landings. The landing gear, borrowed directly from the Spitfire, was weak and collapsed regularly. The fuselage would crack under the shock of arrested landings. Pilots complained that the aircraft was more likely to kill them during recovery than during combat with the enemy. The Seafire had excellent performance in the air, when it actually made it back to the deck. Between 1942 and 1945, the Seafire suffered an accident rate so high that some squadrons became effectively non-combat capable. The Royal Navy continued using it anyway because it was faster than the alternatives. The SB2C Helldiver was an American dive bomber that pilots nicknamed the Beast, or Son of a Bitch Second Class, neither affectionate. Introduced in 1943, the Helldiver was built to replace the earlier SBD Dauntless, but it was bigger, heavier, more complicated, and significantly worse. The aircraft had severe longitudinal instability in dives, requiring constant trim adjustments to keep it level. The canopy design was so restrictive that pilots had limited visibility, particularly over the nose, a critical flaw in a dive bomber. The engine overheated regularly, and the aircraft's structural integrity was questionable in high-speed maneuvers. Pilots consistently reported that the Dauntless, despite being older, was easier to fly and more reliable in combat. The Helldiver remained in service through the end of the war because the Navy had already committed to its production and had nowhere else to go. The Blackburn Skua was a British aircraft designed as a fighter, dive bomber, and reconnaissance platform, which meant it did none of these things well. It was slow, underpowered, and cramped for its two-person crew. In combat, the Skua was outflown by almost every fighter it encountered. Its claim to fame was sinking the German cruiser Königsberg in 1940, but this was achieved through dive bombing in circumstances where the enemy had no air defense. As a fighter, the Skua was a liability. Pilots disliked it intensely. It was kept in service partly because early war aircraft losses meant any functional airframe was useful, and partly because the Royal Navy had limited alternatives. By 1943, surviving Skuas were relegated to convoy escort and coastal patrol duties, about the only role where their poor performance could be tolerated. The Chesapeake was France's answer to a requirement for a modern naval dive bomber in 1939, and it turned out to be a Vought Vindicator with French markings. The aircraft was already obsolescent before France ordered it. By 1940, when French pilots first flew the Chesapeake operationally, it was underpowered, slow, and difficult to maintain. The aircraft suffered from chronic engine failures and structural issues. French naval aviators found it unreliable and frustrating. Following the fall of France, surviving Chesapeakes were transferred to the British, who relegated them to second-line duties and training. The aircraft serves as a reminder that poor procurement decisions made in peacetime often cannot be corrected once war arrives. The Japanese N1K1 Shiden was a high-performance fighter that arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to matter. What made pilots hate it was not poor combat performance. The aircraft was actually quite capable, but its extreme complexity and fragility. The landing gear was mechanically complicated and prone to failure. The aircraft required constant maintenance and adjustment. Its fuel system was unreliable and the engine was temperamental. In the hands of experienced Japanese pilots, the Shiden was effective, but the pilot shortage by 1944 meant most Shiden pilots were inexperienced. Paired with an aircraft that demanded constant attention and offered little forgiveness for mistakes, the casualty rate climbed steeply. The Shiden became less a combat asset and more an aircraft that made training fatalities inevitable. The Blenheim was a British light bomber and fighter that satisfied an Air Ministry requirement for a fast, versatile aircraft. It was fast for 1937. By the time it became operational in 1939, it was already approaching obsolescence. The aircraft was cramped, poorly armed, and offered its three-person crew minimal protection. In combat against German fighters, the Blenheim was hopelessly outclassed. During the Battle of Britain, Blenheim pilots were sent on long-range bomber escort missions in an aircraft that lacked the speed and maneuverability to protect bombers or fight effectively. The casualty rate among Blenheim crews was among the highest of any aircraft type in the Battle of Britain. Pilots disliked the aircraft for its poor visibility, cramped cockpit, and inadequate defensive armament. The Blenheim remained in service throughout the war, primarily because the RAF had invested heavily in production, and because attrition meant any functional airframe was useful. The Mauler was an American single-seat dive bomber that arrived in 1944 after the Navy had already largely moved away from single-seat dive bombing. The aircraft was underpowered and heavy, making it sluggish and difficult to handle. The engine was prone to overheating, and the airframe suffered from structural problems. Pilots found the Mauler difficult to fly in formation and unreliable in combat conditions. The Navy ordered the Mauler primarily because the aircraft industry lobbied for the contract, not because there was a genuine operational need. The aircraft saw minimal service and was quickly withdrawn. It represents a failure of procurement logic rather than aircraft design. The Wapiti was a British general-purpose aircraft that served throughout the 1930s and into World War II, becoming a symbol of the RAF's under-resourcing and poor procurement planning. The aircraft was underpowered, slow, and offered pilots minimal protection from enemy fire. It was designed for colonial policing and reconnaissance in the 1920s, yet somehow remained in frontline service well into the 1940s. Pilots assigned to Wapitis knew they were flying an aircraft that could not outrun or outmaneuver any modern fighter. The landing gear was fragile, and the airframe was prone to structural fatigue. The Wapiti was kept flying not because it was effective, but because the RAF had dozens of them and replacements were not yet available. By 1941, most surviving Wapitis were relegated to training and second-line duties, where their poor performance could at least be tolerated. The Soviet I-180 was an experimental fighter that never entered production. Yet pilots who tested it understood why. The aircraft was overweight, underpowered, and mechanically unreliable. The engine frequently failed, and the airframe exhibited troubling structural issues during flight testing. Control authority was marginal, and the aircraft was unpredictable. In high-speed maneuvers, a test pilot was killed in an I-180 when the tail separated during a dive. The aircraft represented a dead end in Soviet fighter development, abandoned in favor of the more promising Lei GG-3 and Yak-1. However, it serves as a reminder that not every aircraft that reaches the test stage should actually be flown, and that Soviet engineering shortcuts in the late 1930s often resulted in dangerous machines. The Volksjäger was Nazi Germany's desperate response to Allied air superiority in 1945. A lightweight fighter built from non-strategic materials and powered by a single jet engine, the aircraft was rushed into production with minimal testing. Pilots reported severe handling problems, including loss of control in certain flight regimes and an unpredictable stall characteristic. The jet engine, the Heinkel He S-011, was unreliable and prone to catastrophic failure. The landing gear frequently collapsed on landing. The wooden fuselage would delaminate under stress. Pilots feared the aircraft, with good reason. Multiple Volksjägers crashed during training and combat operations due to structural failure or engine malfunction. The aircraft was never effective in combat and served primarily to demonstrate how desperation and poor engineering combine to produce dangerous machines. The Gannet was a British naval aircraft powered by a compound engine, essentially two piston engines driving a single propeller. The engineering was sound in theory but proved problematic in practice. The engine was maintenance-heavy, complex, and prone to failure if any component malfunctioned. The aircraft was large and underpowered, making it sluggish and difficult to recover on a carrier deck. Pilots disliked its handling characteristics and the constant anxiety that one engine would fail without warning, leaving them with inadequate power. The Gannet remained in service for years longer than necessary because the Royal Navy had no replacement available. It became synonymous with over-engineered solutions to simple problems. The Ki-27 was an early Japanese Army fighter that represented sound design for 1936, but became a liability by 1940. The aircraft was lightly built, lightly armed, and offered pilots almost no protection. When it faced more heavily armed and armored fighters, the Ki-27's light construction became a fatal disadvantage. Rounds that would pass through the airframe without causing critical damage would instead shred it. The aircraft had no self-sealing fuel tanks and no armor protection for the pilot. Japanese pilots who transitioned to the Ki-43 Hayabusa considered it a massive improvement, and many were killed flying Ki-27s when the aircraft was withdrawn from frontline service too late. By 1942, the Ki-27 was already obsolescent, yet it remained in use as a trainer and in second-line units, where its poor survivability and lack of protection meant that training accidents were often fatal. The Manchester was a British twin-engine medium bomber that arrived in 1940 with chronic engine problems that were never fully resolved. The Rolls-Royce Vulture engines powering the aircraft were unreliable, prone to overheating, and subject to catastrophic failure without warning. Pilots reported losing engines regularly during operations, forcing them to struggle home on a single engine or ditch in the channel. The aircraft's performance deteriorated rapidly with engine problems, making it extremely difficult to fly. The Manchester was kept in service for 2 years, despite its serious defects, because the RAF needed bombers and had nothing better available. Eventually, the decision was made to re-engine the aircraft with 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, producing the Lancaster, one of the war's best bombers. The Manchester itself is remembered only as the platform that proved the concept before being replaced by something far superior. The Falco was an Italian biplane fighter that served well into World War II, long after biplanes had become obsolete. The aircraft was maneuverable and lightly constructed, but it was slow, roughly 440 kilometers per hour at altitude. When it faced modern monoplane fighters like the Supermarine Spitfire, the speed disadvantage was insurmountable. The Falco could not escape a fight it did not want, and it could not catch an enemy that chose to disengage. Italian pilots recognized the aircraft's obsolescence immediately, yet it remained in frontline service through 1942 because Italy lacked the resources to replace it faster. Pilots assigned to Falcos knew they were flying an aircraft that could not compete with enemy fighters on equal terms. The Falco represents the danger of committing to a design without accounting for how rapidly fighter development was advancing. Comet was a rocket-powered interceptor that represented a radical approach to fighting high-altitude bombers. The aircraft was fast, extremely fast, capable of over 950 kilometers per hour. However, it was also dangerous to its own pilots. The rocket engine provided only 8 minutes of powered flight, forcing pilots to climb, intercept, and attack within a narrow window. If the engine failed to ignite or shut down prematurely, the pilot had a glider with minimal lift. The fuel itself, a combination of hydrazine and methanol, was hypergolic and would ignite spontaneously if the aircraft was involved in an accident. Multiple pilots were killed when comets crashed and the fuel ignited, burning them alive in the wreckage. The aircraft was difficult to control at high speed, and several pilots lost control during combat maneuvers. The Comet represents the ultimate example of sacrificing pilot safety for performance. The Fizir was a Yugoslav reconnaissance and ground attack aircraft that served in the 1930s and early 1940s. The aircraft was underpowered, slow, and offered minimal defensive armament. It was designed for colonial-style operations and had no capability to defend itself against modern fighters. When Yugoslavia fell to German invasion in 1941, surviving Fizirs were rapidly rendered obsolete. The aircraft had poor visibility for reconnaissance missions and was vulnerable to any fighter opposition. Yugoslav pilots who flew the Fizir recognized it as a second-rate machine, yet it represented the best their small air force could produce with available resources. The Fizir never saw significant combat against well-equipped opponents, remaining primarily on training and reconnaissance duties in peripheral theaters. The Bloch MB.170 was a French reconnaissance aircraft that arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to affect the outcome of the 1940 campaign. The aircraft was underpowered and slow, achieving roughly 520 kilometers per hour at altitude. It was lightly armed, relying on speed and altitude to escape enemy fighters, neither of which it possessed in abundance. When German fighters encountered MB.170s, the French aircraft could neither outrun nor outfight their opponents. The few that survived the 1940 campaign were captured and operated by the Germans, who found them marginally useful as reconnaissance platforms but never considered them anything other than inferior machines. The MB.170 represents France's desperate attempt to modernize its air force while facing a more rapidly advancing German aviation industry. Production delays and poor engine performance meant the aircraft was always one generation behind the fighters it would face.